It is May 8, 1945. Adolf Hitler is celebrating with his generals across the radio. The imminent victory of the Third Reich. British and American leaders are dead or captured. Mussolini rules the British Empire. Japan has defeated the United States and China and established the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. And there is nothing that can stop the Axis powers from redrawing the map of the world in their mold. In this alternate timeline, we're going to explore what would have happened if Hitler had won World War II. So, let's talk about it. If Hitler had won World War II, the map of Europe would look very different. France would probably cease to exist as its own country. Its northern half would be annexed into Germany, while the southern half would become an Italian satellite state. Scandinavia would also likely be under some form of German control. Either Denmark and Norway would be annexed, or they would simply become client states like Vichy France. The Soviet Union would either cease to exist or would be greatly weakened. As Hitler's first step after defeating the USSR would be the invasion of Siberia, conquering the resource-rich region for the Germans and their allies. Finland would likely be another German ally, especially since they fought alongside the Germans during the Winter War and Continuation War against the Soviets. The Balkans would be fully under the control of the Italians. This would mean that Greece, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Serbia, Croatia, and Albania would all be Italian client states. Only Turkey would remain outside of the Axis sphere of influence in the region. The rest of Europe would likely be divided between Japan and Germany. Britain would be split between the Germans and Japanese. Ireland would likely be annexed into the British portion of the island, and Scotland would go to the Germans. Spain and Portugal would likely both become Japanese allies. Switzerland and Austria would likely become German client states. And only Italy, France, and Sweden would remain independent. But this victory would not come without great cost. Much of Europe would be utterly devastated and depopulated. Cities would be in ruins and millions would be dead. Even if some countries would gain land from this war, like Italy, who would get most of Yugoslavia and Greece? The victory would not be worth the loss of life and destruction of industry and infrastructure. But we're not done yet. Before exploring how this would impact the world, let us talk about how the Nazis would change the course of history with their advanced weaponry and technology. Nazi Germany was actually one of the most technologically advanced nations of the time. The Germans were the first to invent things such as the guided missile, the submarine-launched ballistic missile, jet aircraft, jet-powered missiles, helicopter, practical synthetic rubber, practical plastic, gasoline, additives, X-ray equipment, diesel engines, etc. They were actually so advanced that many of their weapons were decades ahead of their time. The Nazis had developed many of these technologies through their extensive research into things such as rocketry, jet propulsion, aerodynamics, and ballistics. But what is even more fascinating is that the Nazis were planning on taking their technology even further with projects such as the Vergeltungswaffe 2, or Vengeance Weapon 2. This was going to be the first intercontinental ballistic missile, which would allow the Germans to strike targets thousands of miles away with deadly accuracy. It is believed that with enough time, the Nazis would have developed powerful enough missiles that could reach the United States. The Nazis were even developing early computer technology and had already made significant advances in things such as radar and sonar. The Nazis also had plans for the future of German technology. They were planning on harnessing nuclear power to develop things such as nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines. So now let's explore how this would impact the world, since the Nazis would have likely conquered the Soviet Union and annexed Siberia. They would have gained control of many of the USSR's oil fields and military bases. This would have given them the resources to expand their military and continue developing new technologies. In fact, many historians believe that the Nazis would have eventually developed nuclear weapons if the war had dragged on longer. With all of the oil from the USSR, plus the natural resources from all of the other countries they conquered, the Nazis could have easily developed advanced weaponry, vehicles, and aircraft, perhaps even developing the first moon rocket. After all, the Nazis were already planning on launching a manned rocket to the moon by the year 2000, and who knows what else they would have accomplished if they had won the war. But it wasn't just technology that the Nazis were advancing. They were also changing the cultural landscape of Europe. As we all know, the Nazis suppressed and persecuted many religious groups, especially the Jews. If they had won the war, they would have likely succeeded in their goal of creating a racially pure German nation. This would have meant that people of different races and religions would have faced even worse persecution than they did in our timeline. Now, the Nazis were also planning on changing the culture of Germany and Europe as a whole. They wanted to create a society based on their idea of German culture and values. This would have meant that things such as art, literature, and music would have been heavily censored and controlled by the government. The Nazis would have likely banned many books and works of art that they deemed as degenerate or un-German. They would have also likely tried to control the media and use it to spread their propaganda. It is very likely that famous figures who opposed the Nazi regime, such as Albert Einstein and Thomas Mann, would have left Germany and become exiles. And those who remained in Germany would have likely had to conform to the Nazi ideology or face persecution. German culture would have likely become very nationalistic and militaristic, with a heavy emphasis on things such as duty, honor, and loyalty. The Nazis would have likely promoted traditional gender roles and values, and would have discouraged things such as individualism and creativity. It is likely that sports would have become a major part of German culture, and that there would have been a heavy focus on things such as fitness and competition. Overall, German culture would have likely become very rigid and conformist. So what would the modern-day world look like if Hitler had won World War II? If Hitler had won World War II, the Cold War would have never happened. There is no way that the United States would have intervened in Europe if the continent was under the full control of Germany and Italy. The U.S. was already isolated from the rest of the world in the 1930s and had little interest in getting involved in European affairs. Sure, they would have probably continued supporting Britain. But without the atomic bomb, Britain wouldn't have really needed any help. Instead of fighting communism, the United States would have been fighting fascism. The U.S. would have been forced to choose sides in conflicts around the world between fascist nations and their allies. This would have been especially true in places such as Latin America and Asia, where fascism was becoming increasingly popular. Instead of the Iron Curtain dividing Europe, there would have been a cultural divide between the fascist nations and the rest of the world. The United States would have likely formed alliances with countries such as Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia to prevent the spread of fascism. The United Nations would have likely been dominated by fascist nations and would have done little to stop them from spreading their ideology around the world. Instead of the Cold War dividing the world into two superpowers, we would have had a multipolar world with several powerful nations. The United States would have remained a superpower, but would have been challenged by the combined might of Germany, Italy, and Japan. The Soviet Union may have still existed and would have likely formed an alliance with China to counter the fascists. This would have created a balance of power between the two sides and could have led to further conflicts around the world. All in all, the world would look terrifyingly different if Hitler had won World War II. Germany would have become a global superpower, possibly even dominating Europe. And the Cold War would have never happened. Who knows what else would have transpired? Maybe we would live in a world today where the government is trying to take away your books and control your culture. The possibilities are endless. Well guys, that's it for today's video. Thank you so much for watching. Now, please drop a like and subscribe for more content. Thanks again, and stay tuned.